Welcome to our fourth and final panel of the afternoon. Thank you all for being here. It's gorgeous outside. I'm looking forward to getting out there and getting some sunshine, as I'm sure you all are, but thanks for sticking around this afternoon. My name is Sierra Barnes, and I'm a board member here at Housing Land Advocates. In my day job, I do fundraising and communications for a local affordable housing nonprofit called Bridge Meadows. We build intentional intergenerational affordable housing, which is a lot of big words that I won't get into now, but I was hearing some whispers earlier about pre-development funding, and my fundraising brain was really going off. So thank you for whoever was saying that earlier. I am really excited about this panel today. This is sort of a continuation of what we were just leaving off on innovations in housing production and housing production strategies. I'm not going to spend too much time because I want these folks to get into their content, but these panelists are going to explore new and progressive housing production ideas and strategies to meet our housing production needs here so that we can continue building fair and affordable housing for all folks across the state. Everything from tiny home communities to age-friendly design to trauma-informed design principles. We'll hear about all sorts of things that we heard a little bit about in the last session regarding I think it was called agri-hoods. I'm a big fan of that term. I think I'm going to be using that, throwing that around in my vernacular now. We're going to learn how these innovations can not only accelerate production, but also enhance affordability, sustainability, and adaptability in the face of our ever-changing needs. We know that housing, the policy side, the funding side, it all moves really fast. So what are some of the new ideas that are out there that we've tried, that we're learning from, that we can all take some inspiration from? So I'm going to introduce you to our three folks here next to me. Alan DeLaTorre is a self-described urban gerontologist who is focused on advancing urban policy, city planning, and age-friendly housing and communities. He's been involved in Portland's age-friendly efforts since 2006. Dr. DeLaTorre currently serves as an age-friendly consultant and as an adjunct research associate and professor at PSU's College of Urban and Public Affairs, where he teaches courses in gerontology and urban studies and planning. He's passionate about accessible and affordable housing and ensuring that Portland continues to become age-friendly and disability inclusive. For 25 years, Otte has been helping create meaningful architecture that people love. Focusing on social impact in housing, education, and health. His work at Holst spans notable projects, including Bud Clark Commons, the Rockwood Youth Campus, and Fora Health. On the boards and under construction, Dave is helping lead the design of East County Library, the Patricia Valian Research Arts Center for the Creative Arts, and hundreds of deeply affordable homes across the Portland region. As a board member of the Mental Health and Addiction Association of Oregon and volunteer for many local nonprofit organizations, Dave strives to give back to his community by bringing the most design to those with the least in society. And finally, we have Celestina Teva, who is a housing planner with the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development. Their career in housing has spanned many specialties, but focuses on equity and earth-based institutional, systemic, and cultural change. Prior experience includes preservation of manufactured home park affordable housing as resident-owned cooperatives, post-wildfire affordable housing redevelopment, housing as resident, I just read that line. Sorry, everybody. Collaboration with mass timber pilot projects, service with the Oregon Housing Alliance policy work groups, construction of tiny homes and ADUs, advisory committee service in local housing and comprehensive planning, and the co-founding Real Estate Professionals Against Institutional Racism or Repair project, while operating a change-centered real estate brokerage. That was a lot of words. These are some really incredible folks. I'm excited to have them all here with me. I'm going to turn it right over to Dr. DeLaTorre to get us started on this content.
Thanks to Sierra and Sam for getting my updated presentation ready to go. I really appreciate that. How many other urban gerontologists do you know? I kind of made that up, so I think I'm the only one at this point, but I came here 21 and a half years ago to Portland to study urban studies with a focus on urban planning and gerontology here at Portland State, and have really never left at that point. I'm going to get here to the very front piece, and I want to say when I arrived, I almost immediately started doing what I'm about to do, which is to say or ask, what about older adults? What about people with disabilities? And for all of you who are doing innovative work in the policy arena and advocating for change and are making policy change, directing organizations, what about older adults? What about people with disabilities? So keep that in mind, because as I'm going to show you, that is our future that we are moving towards. So it's a demographic imperative, and I will jump in. So I want to talk about a few things first. This is interesting, by the way. I'm looking at the screen, reading what's behind me. So I think it's the live screen here. But first and foremost, we are aging individually, because the other option's not so great, and collectively, right? As a society, as a population, our age structure is markedly changing indefinitely. We will not go back to a population pyramid like we saw prior to World War II. Things are changing dramatically. Older adults and people with disabilities have needs, but they are also assets to our community. And so we have to think beyond just meeting those needs and enabling them to be critically important and engaged people within our societies. Adequate housing is a right for everyone, yet our current housing is not accessible, affordable, equitable, or sustainable. And these things are all critically important to think about. Not that we're not making progress, but there's more that's needed in this arena. Creating accessible, affordable housing in complete communities is important as it supports inclusion, access, aging in place, social connections, and livability. And I'll get to more ideas about where we can go with this toward the end. Three things I want to touch on today. So the first is kind of thinking about upstream approaches to housing these populations, thinking about housing needs and strategies, and ending with some work that I finished at the City of Portland in August of this last year called Age and Disability Inclusive Neighborhoods. And I should say that I spent about 4 years at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability doing some contract work, and then about 3.5 years as staff, where I was able to shape this plan, which is a discussion draft. It is not moved forward into a final kind of action plan at this point. And I'm no longer with the city, so there's some need for outside external advocacy to continue to move some things forward. Just a little bit about what influences health in older adults, right? So we have the behaviors that we take, and it was interesting to hear about things like substance use disorder in the last presentation. Our age-related changes, which are normal, that we'll all experience, right? The thinning of our hair, the loss of elasticity of our skin, those are normal. Then there's diseases, everything from chronic diseases to thinking about cancer and how we're able to address these issues as we continue to age. Genetics make up a big part of it, but that's only part of the issue. I've heard genetics loads the gun, right? And the environment kind of pulls the trigger, and there's the kind of combination of needs that we need to think about. But for us, we need to consider those individual influences, but we are doing work on the other side. How are we shaping our environments to meet the needs of these populations? Housing is clearly an important piece. Our social facilities, and how do we partner with service providers, nonprofit organizations, the development of infrastructure that are important to the community, assistive technologies that are not just rapidly evolving, but are also both problematic. Like, do we want our older adults being taken care of by robots? Or do we want to make sure that we've got social connectivity and they're thriving in the places that they live? And the final piece is mobility and transportation, right? Housing is as good as it is. What can we get to? How do we get there? And do we have opportunities for kind of connecting the dots from the start to the end, which again, I'll talk a little bit about as we move forward. So I want to chat a little bit about some key determinants. So kind of putting on my public health hat here. So what determinants are there of health and well-being for housing of older adults and people with disabilities? And for folks who are looking for references, I'm an academic, and so I've kind of put at the bottom hyperlinks. So if you see the slides afterwards and you want to follow up on where this came from, you can do that. I just want to also quickly point to the screenshot here of this idea that came from All Things Considered, this report on the fact that millions of seniors struggle to find affordable housing, and it's about to get a lot worse. And this is a imperative for us to think about moving forward. A few things. We have the need for culturally adequate and appropriate housing. And there was a conversation earlier about kind of where trans communities are. There's a real issue with older adults sometimes moving from an independent housing to a kind of social housing environment, whether it's long-term care facilities or an adult foster home, and going back in the closet of needing to hide who they are. This is a trend that is really specific to older adults who've kind of changed and evolved over time. with their needs in their communities. Habitability, right? How high of quality is the housing? You know, is this something that needs repair in some way to get people to age in that home over time? Accessible physical environments. And this is really at the heart of where we think about, I think, housing need and housing production strategies, everything from entrances. Can we stop putting stairs? Like, seriously, can we just stop putting stairs in housing? I think that would be my kind of silver wand or whatever, magic wand if I had it, is to say, let's figure out the thresholds that allow people to get into a house, but keeps the water out, and just make that as replicable, as common as possible. And, you know, there are going to be constraints that happen, lots that are raised above grade, that maybe that's our exception to things, but let's start doing away with stairs, especially in residential homes that are not multifamily. Because if you've got an elevator in that building, it's going to be a good thing for you. This image here came from a courtyard housing design that the city of Portland ran more than 10 years ago. This idea of adaptability is something that we need to understand and move forward. So not just the adaptability of this structure. So this shows kind of how a single family or a single kind of household unit has evolved to maybe have two different folks who are in there. Where's the shared spaces? Where are the separated spaces? So that adaptable kind of housing structure allows for change in our family dynamics, which naturally occurs as we get older and become empty nesters, et cetera. And I think the other piece that's really important is, how do we make more adaptable environments? So something as simple as trying to ensure that the bathrooms that we are creating are backed so that a grab bar could go in there easily without the potential for a fall in the future, or needing to put that type of backing in, and that reconstruction cost really starts to become prohibitive. And I did a not very academic study about 5 years ago that showed that starting with visitable or accessible design was a marginal kind of increase in cost, and retrofitting our housing stock is hugely expensive. And so we need to understand, how can we do this stuff up front, get it built into new housing, rather than needing to kind of go back and spend more money in retrofitting things. That's also needed, but everything moving forward should be more accessible to meet the needs, not just of older adults and people with disabilities, parents, cyclists, et cetera. A zero-step entrance helps everybody, just like a curb cut does. So again, let's move in that direction if we can. Another part of the courtyard housing competition, this is the bird's eye view of this award winner from the competition, shows opportunities for connectivity, not just the courtyard kind of design of getting people looking at each other and interacting with each other, but a social space where people could have meals. That's a kind of common facility for individuals. And then I want to kind of get a little bit into the weeds with some work I did with a student a couple years ago. I want to name Eiji Toda, who's just graduated from his MPH MERP program, and he helped and put together a series of GIS maps that looked at age-friendly environments, so age-friendly social, service, and physical environments. And so this is an example of what we have. This first one being the social environment, you see there's kind of a little bit more spread out from just the downtown central area. You see stuff in the inner north, northeast. I thought I'd push that. As we get to what would be the service environment, surprisingly, we have a robust service environment that moves all the way out into East Portland and into East County. That's from healthcare facilities. It's also from services that are being provided by the county and the state. And so that idea of actually having access to services is not as concentrated in inner Portland as the physical and social environments would be. And then this is the physical, age-friendly physical environments. And again, if you have interest in the inputs that are involved with this, there's a link on this PowerPoint slide deck a little bit later. This is a Esri story map. So it kind of talks about not just the inputs, but the kind of way in which we came through the analyses with references, data sources, et cetera, at the tail end of it. So kind of moving into the demographic imperative. And I'd say that at the moment, not just Portland, but the state and the United States has got two major imperatives, right? We are diversifying as a society, and it's important for us to understand those issues. And we are aging. We are aging in a rapid and unprecedented manner. And this is our time. Our window of opportunity is shrinking. And I can point to an American Planning Association article in 1946 that makes this same case, but not a lot's been done since then. And so really, it's time. We need to start moving on this stuff. And I appreciate the work that DLCD and the city of Portland's been doing around housing needs analyses and production strategies. And that's a way to get there. This graph in particular is from 2017, so it doesn't show that dip in life expectancy that occurred due to COVID, but that continuation of the growth in life expectancy is expected to continue, i.e. we are getting older, right? Our society is getting older, and so it's an important trend to understand. Also, we are getting older everywhere. So not just in large urban areas in the center, but in the fringe, in suburban areas, in the rural and remote communities, this is a common trend. And globally, this is a trend in almost every country across the world. There are some exceptions, but we are collectively working on these issues with the World Health Organization, AARP, and others. This is a racial equity issue. So when we dig deep into understanding the trends related to accessibility, disability, that we can look and understand that at 3 age groupings here, 0 to 17, 18 to 64, and 65 plus, that the highest proportions of disabilities exist in our Black, Native, and mixed race communities, period. This is a racial equity issue. So this is not a different issue. This is part of that argument and part of those strategies that we need to work through. We are experiencing a rise in the number of older adults and people with disabilities who are experiencing houselessness and are having difficulties in navigating the current systems. This graph is showing the rise in shelters needed for older adults. There's also another issue that's really important to understand, that people who are living on the street are experiencing what I would call in the field as a geriatric condition, that they are rapidly aging based on what they're experiencing, a lack of sleep, substance use disorder, other issues that are real challenges. And so when people are faced with those challenges, it's exacerbating their functional ability, their ability to kind of meet their own needs. And so there's an extra support that's needed to kind of think about that. And as my colleague Alan Hines, who works for Community Vision, would note, even though our shelters may be ADA accessible and meet those minimum standards, it doesn't mean that they meet the needs of the people who are staying there. And there's a lot that's needed to think about best practices and better approaches to these things. Just a quick kind of note on the mismatch here. So about 40% of our households have an older adult, age 65 and older, or a person with a disability, or both, that live in that household. About 1 in 8 households have a person who is using a wheelchair or a mobility device that's needed. That's 12.5% of the population. Our current housing stock has less than 1% that meets that need. This is a national trend. We don't have really good data at the local and state level, but this is a clear kind of trend that I think are needing to work toward addressing. Moving forward, this need will grow. There are a number of things that are important, and I'm going to go through a few data points here, but I want to point to the kind of far end of things and to show that there's growth in households that are occurring kind of for older adults. The number of those age 65 plus will expand. Older adult households will account for it. This is an important kind of piece to listen to. Virtually all household growth from 2020 to 2030 will be due to an older adult household. And moving forward in 2035 or 2030 to 2040, most of new households will have an older adult member of that household, right? So this is not an issue we can gloss over as it's just another side issue. This is integral to our future trends and dynamics. We need an increase in supply of affordable homes, including what the Urban Institute would say would be specifically condominiums, although I would say that there are some challenges in Oregon with condominiums. We need to better tailor these needs through a number of land use approaches. Overall, the number or the age 65 plus, as my colleague Michael Deshane would say, is a crappy variable, right? 65 plus is what we use often to talk about older adults, but housing for older adults starts at 55 plus if we're talking about nonprofit development and LIHTC, right? That when we think about federal programs, that's 62 plus. So if we earmark everything we're doing to 65 plus, we're missing the boat on some of these larger trends. All Gen Xers, and I'm in that kind of cohort, will qualify for senior housing by 2045. Again, an incredibly important trend. When we're talking about our future needs and production strategies, we need to drop the idea that older adult planning, housing planning for older adults is about boomers. Right? There's ageism that exists. There's a okay boomer kind of meme that took off like wildfire 5-6 years ago. When I started working at the city of Portland, people literally asked me, why do we have an age-friendly city program? Older adults are well-to-do, they're often white and homeowners. That misses a huge proportion of our population. It's not a homogeneous population. And so there's more that we need to do to understand the nuances and the subpopulations that exist within this generation. And I think that this is the hook. When we're talking about housing production for 2045, this is the millennials that we're planning for, right? A disadvantaged cohort that is struggling to find jobs, that has entered the job market at the wrong time, that has had other issues. And so our older adults that we're talking about are the folks who are all in this room, right? Older adults that for the future include all of these populations, mine, millennials, it's an interesting kind of thought, but we need to stop thinking about this just as the well-to-do boomers who we're planning for. I'm going to finish today by talking about the project that I worked on at the City of Portland called Age and Disability Inclusive Neighborhoods. There's a discussion draft that's available. If you're interested in hearing more, you could do a quick search like OPB Age-Friendly Aiden, and there's a Think Out Loud interview that I did in October. Dave Miller was a pleasant person to kind of talk with, so it was really kind of nice. But this draft action plan has not moved forward markedly. I stopped working for the city, not because of my choice, but because of changes in the way that discretionary funding was being worked on. We need to continue to move this stuff forward in a number of ways. And the strategies include housing and land use, everything from mobility, aging and community, climate planning, community involvement, employment and economy, age equity. How are we doing on time here? Okay. I've got a few strategies that I just wanted to end with here. So the first is related to housing and land use and facilitating not just aging in place, but social connectivity. Has anybody kind of read through or heard about our Surgeon General's report that we are experiencing an epidemic of loneliness and isolation in the United States, right? This is a true trend that needs to be addressed in our housing production strategies moving forward, not just in single family, but multifamily and kind of throughout our communities. So a few of the actions that have been recommended: establish adaptable housing standards like we talked about earlier. So what can we do to really make our housing meet our needs as they evolve over time? How do we support aging in place? By developing communication pathways that advance middle housing development. And this is specific. So like in the city of Portland, we have liberalized our code. The state of Oregon's liberalized kind of our statewide land use planning laws. This idea that currently you could build 2 ADUs in our backyard, but what happens the moment that you say, oh, I kind of want to do now a cottage cluster, even though I have an ADU? Do we have a pathway to do that? Do people still have to pay back the $20,000 in system development charges? Could we create communication documents that say, you own a piece of property, you want to house other people on your property, here are your options and here's how you get there? Because I don't know how many of you have looked at the 1900 pages of Title 33. Some of you, yeah, exactly. Well, that's Elizabeth, right? Yeah, it's kind of a unique person in that I have not read all 1900 pages, but I'm really good at searching for terms. And so I've kind of figured out that it largely lacks information around aging and disability and inclusive housing for these populations. But getting clear documentation to folks to say, here's what you can do to help us solve those problems. And it was born from the idea that my parents, who are divorced, caring for my sister with a disability, live side by side with each other. And it's really uncommon to have 2 properties owned side by side, where we're starting to say, what could we do that's beyond what people have done before? Could we create a cottage cluster? Should we condoize? Should we do a land division? Right? Like, I've got thoughts, but my parents are like, I don't even know what those terms mean. So how can we get that type of information to people who have assets, who can transform their properties to opportunities in the future for not just themselves, but for other members of the community? How do we advance age-friendly cottage clusters? And I love the idea of a design competition, but cottage clusters for me seem to hold a lot of promise and something I'd like to see us dig into more moving forward. Also establishing incentives that meet the needs, community benefits that meet the needs, but thinking specifically about population aging. So Multnomah County and the state of Oregon have daycare deserts for children. There are also very few adult daycare centers. And for somebody who is a sandwich generation person who's going to be caring for my adult parents, my sister with a disability, and my children, I'm going to need some ideas on how to make all of this stuff work. And directly after this meeting, I've got 3 pickups. My mom's not feeling great. And how do you navigate those things in a way that works for everybody? So the second strategy, much related to land use, is really understanding how our centers and to a certain extent corridors can really meet the direct needs of older adults and people with disabilities. Can we integrate these communities, including caregivers, into our conversations around complete communities? Caregivers are an important component because they can understand the trends and patterns and experiences of people with disabilities who might not always be able to advocate on their own. But to the greatest extent possible, we should bring those people to the table to tell their stories from that first-person lived experience perspective. Can we co-create and strategically locate services? The city of Portland, in completing complete communities or striving for them, needs the county at the table. We need nonprofits at the table. We need to understand where service centers are being repurposed, where I know TriMet and the TOD work that they're doing has an interest in understanding aging in place and these types of ideas. How do we work across sectors to kind of move toward more complete communities? Really, again, bolstering that point, how do we move toward accessible and affordable housing that would be in and near those centers? And personally, I think in Portland that we would be well served by thinking about some major project work in East Portland to kind of enliven and create destinations for folks who are out there, for tourists, for others who kind of want to see East Portland as a destination. And then this idea of improving first and last mile service. So there are not a lot of people with disabilities and older adults who are frail who are jumping on scooters or rented bikes. But are there other options, right? Small vans, micro transit rather than the micro mobility, thinking about the improvement of our environments and physical infrastructure to allow people to walk and roll in a more seamless kind of manner. And I'm going to end here by kind of throwing a few other ideas that come from this aid and action plan forward. So the city can work toward revising elder and disabled high density housing. First of all, we don't really use the term elderly anymore. So that's a change that we could make just simply to the name of this. But the incentives that are here baked into this particular code are not actually usable anymore for the community. So it's kind of a dormant or unusable kind of piece of policy. Action 3.3, how do we engage government partners in the community to ensure accessible parking is available? And this has something to do with the climate-friendly and equitable communities, and that we've got to make some changes there because in some ways the baby was thrown out with the bathwater and that the ADA wasn't baked into that work. But more importantly, we need to ask the community what it means to get around, to be able to park, drive, use transit when there are people with disabilities. And when we were going through some of this work at the city, there was this kind of feeling that, oh, well, we haven't done that outreach, so we don't know. So we're just going to have to pass because of a time-sensitive kind of process. We need to do better. We need to include people in this conversation because single occupancy vehicles can be game changers for people with disabilities. How do we integrate dementia-friendly approaches, right? So thinking about disability, but specifically targeting that cognitive change that happens in older adults, and as a disability. Alzheimer's is not a natural process of aging; it's a disease-related process. How do we utilize best practices to create accessible and inclusive plazas? And this work is happening in a number of places, but these are the places we want people to connect. We want to build community. We want them to be placemaking destinations in our community. We have to start with the folks who are, the 8 to 80 concept is a great way to think about this. Planning for people from the ages of 8 to 80 or 8 months to 88 years or whatever kind of you think about across the life course. How do we support aging in place and aging in community? To get to Margaret Salazar's point, it's not just about the home, but it's about the neighborhood as well. So maybe the home you live in is not a good home for you, but a place around the corner is, or that adult foster home that is accepting Medicaid is perfect for somebody who wants to live in a community setting but doesn't like that large institutional setting. Then how do we integrate folks into the climate action planning who have been left out? And I'd say at this point that older adults are really primed for doing this work. There's a lot of environmentalism that exists within that population, but caregivers and people with disabilities have not shown up in our climate planning action plans locally. I can't say much about that at the state level, but they need to be a part of that process and having conversations with us. Thank you very much for letting me talk about this. I know this is not a bunch of feel-good, great strategies in the future, but they're long thought out, and I hope to continue to work. I'm really pleased and feel privileged to be a part of the NAPTAC and working on some of the housing production stuff that's happening at the state level. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Alan. And now Dave Otte.
So looking at ourselves here. Okay. Do the best we can. All right, so let's start with I'm going to do an audible and start with an exercise. If you're able, everybody please stand up. I heard that there's no silver bullet for the housing crisis. So yeah, stretch. It's that time of day. We're all going to get outside into the sunshine and in bed. If your first name starts with an F, please stay standing and everyone else sit down. First name with an F. Anyone? Oh, good. No, nobody. Nobody's name starts with an F. Well, 1% of the population, their first name starts with an F. We don't have anybody here today, but say that was me. If I was the only person in this room whose first name started with an F, do you think that all of you could help me find a place to live if I was homeless? Could you all come together and do that? I think you could. This is not an intractable problem. This is a 1% problem. And the fact that our society treats housing as a commodity and not as a human right is the reason why it's intractable. So I just want to start with that. My name's Dave. I'm one of the owners and principals at Holst Architecture. We are a firm of about 50 people. We're a B Corp located both in Portland, Oregon, and now in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We are a women-owned firm, so go International Women's Day. And I get to work with some really amazing people every day, trying to provide housing, health, and education to people that deserve it the most. I wanted to spend some time today talking about 6 aspects of housing design principles that we try to focus on at Holst. They're in no particular order: worth and value, community connections, activated and welcoming, housing is healthcare. We've heard that today. Inclusive design and trauma-informed design. And so I'm going to touch on 5 of these aspects, and then activated and welcoming is kind of an overarching thing that all of our projects try to achieve. The first is housing is healthcare. The blue bars are the percentages of folks with conditions that are unhoused, and the white bars are people that are housed. At the bottom, you can't quite see, is diabetes, hypertension, heart attack, HIV, hepatitis, depression, and substance abuse. It is fundamentally true and proven that health outcomes improve when you are housed. And that also equates to business versus people. It equates to business too. It's cheaper to house people. One project that I worked on that helps demonstrate this is the Bud Clark Commons. This was a project that started in 2007, was completed in 2011. It is at the base of the Burnside or the Broadway Bridge in Northwest Portland, next to Union Station. And it has 3 major components. It has 130 units of permanent supportive housing, mostly all studios upstairs. It's got a day center for anybody coming off the street looking for services, and it's got a shelter for 90 men on the first floor. We tried to do a number of things here to try to make this place welcoming to folks by giving outdoor spaces where people don't have to be on the sidewalk, by bringing in natural materials and access to daylight, access to nature. Really humane, dignified spaces that folks don't usually encounter when they're homeless. We tried to provide places where people can be together, either inside, outside, places where people can exercise, places where people can have a human life and not feel like they're less than human. We tried to bring in natural materials and access to daylight on all the floors. Every floor has a place where you can get outside, and at almost any point in the building, you can see outside. And then inside the units, this is before anybody moved in, pretty sparse, but we provided furniture. We provided all of the amenities that somebody needs in a very, very small unit. These were about 300 square feet, but they all had kitchens, bathrooms, and fully furnished. Also bed bug proof, which I can tell you way too much about bed bugs if you want to know. But this is my favorite picture of the units. This is during the 1-year warranty walk. One of the gentlemen whose life was completely transformed by the Bud Clark Commons. He had been living in Forest Park before he moved in, and the fact that he had housing completely changed his life, and he was very grateful. Now, the flip side is there's also lots of tragedy in this building. There's lots of folks where this is their last stop on earth because this is a place where they house the people that are the hardest to house in the city. But that's part of what this work is about. There's triumph and there's tragedy for everybody that it encounters. Results. Oh my gosh, that slide did not work. That's really unfortunate. Medicaid costs on average were cut in half in the first year for all the residents that live at the Bud Clark Commons. Went from over $1,000 per month down to 500. The average at the time was around 450. And as time goes on, that chart continues to go down. I'm sorry that the slide didn't work. Next up, I want to talk about community connections. This is a project called the Argyle Gardens in North Portland in the Kenton neighborhood. This was a very interesting project that got its seed from a grant from the Meyer Memorial Trust looking at housing innovation. We did a couple really innovative things on this project. One was trying to look at modular housing and how to create a prototype that could be deployed across the entire state of Oregon. We based our initial studies on tiny home villages, but quickly moved to a more permanent type of organization where we took a kit of parts and tried to make very replicable parts and pieces that could fit on any kind of site, whether it's rural, urban, suburban, in a neighborhood, in an industrial site, but basically parts and pieces that could easily be moved. We then developed a single prototype that's really a duplex, where we have 12 people living in one building, 6 people on the ground floor, 6 people on the second floor, 6 people share 2 bathrooms and 1 kitchen and living space. So they're really like big apartments. And then we found, and then we build them out of modules, so you can see kind of how the size of the modules work. And here they are being put into place in Kenton. The end result is a community that is also, I talked about triumph and tragedy. There's folks, George still lives here and it has completely changed his life. I keep up with him and find out how he's doing. It's also been complete tragedy for some folks that can't get along in co-living environments. You may have read about this project in the news. So it is definitely an experiment and a project that we are trying to learn from, but we're trying to find new ways of how people can live together in community. The other aspect of this project was to drive down rents. The goal was to get a bedroom in this building to be less than $400, and we were able to achieve that. But at the same time, the downside is together, there's both the good and the bad. Some pictures of Argyle Gardens. That's that interior staircase in one of the sleeping rooms. These are a couple folks that first moved in. This is Dahlia on the left and George on the right. Dahlia I had known from a women's shelter that Transition Projects owned and operated. And it was really gratifying to see her get to move in. The next aspect of affordable housing design I'd like to talk about is trauma-informed design. This is something that a lot of folks are talking about these days. I like to think that we've been trying to do trauma-informed design ever since I started being an architect, but 6 aspects of trauma-informed design that we try to focus on are safety, connections to nature, comfort, coherency, de-escalation, and empowerment. The project I want to talk about related to trauma-informed design is called Fora Health. This is an addiction and recovery residential facility and outpatient facility that was built in the Gateway neighborhood of East Portland. This is a diagram kind of how the building is organized. It's a really large program that we tried to break down into a series of neighborhoods and to give it a residential scale with the roof shape. But we have basically administration offices on one side. We have all of the inpatient stuff on the ground floor, residential treatment upstairs, and then we have an outpatient clinic on the side. And then the lobby is really the piece that brings everything together. But you can see that, one of the aspects of trauma-informed design is comfort to reduce environmental stressors and negative stimuli. De-escalation, providing spaces for self-care. This is an art studio that we built in the building. Empowerment, providing choices for people so that they can have self-autonomy. nature, provide connections to the natural world. So the whole building is organized around a central courtyard and a garden space, as well as a basketball hoop. Safety, designed for both actual safety and perceived safety. So we're putting this in a neighborhood that has seen a lot of issues around camping and a lot of issues around drug dealing. And so trying to create a drug and alcohol treatment center that felt both secure for the residents, but also for the neighborhood was a delicate balance. So trying to do things like making the fence into a piece of art, and really letting the vegetation and the outdoor spaces be these in-between spaces that can help provide that sense of safety. The next piece I'd like to talk about is inclusive design. I think we heard a lot about that around aging in place and around people with disabilities. It's been 34 years now since the Capitol crawl, since ADA became a part of our lexicon. And ADA really, I think, is the baseline. It's the minimum that we should be doing. We should be designing for disabled joy. We should be designing for everybody. And there's a good reason for that, because a much higher percentage than you would think of people have some kind of disability in our country. 26% of all US adults have something, whether it's mobility, cognition, lack of independent living, hearing, vision, or ability for self-care. So when you think about that, that's more than 1 out of every 4 people have some kind of disability. So why do we treat it as a 5% problem when it's a 25% problem? So these slides, I want to give credit to Rachel Gott, who's here today from Holst Architecture. She helped put this together, and working with community vision and reach community development. Margaret, I don't know if she's still here. Working on a project for called 73 Foster in the Foster Powell neighborhood. And we tried to focus on aspects around mobility and height, vision, hearing and acoustics, and cognitive access to go above and beyond the code. And this is a pretty technical drawing. I won't go into it too much, but basically the idea is this building that's built around a courtyard, every aspect of it, whether it's community space, the lobby, the units, the circulation spaces, we tried to have those lenses of design around all of those different parts and pieces to try and make the spaces more welcoming for everybody. So what does that mean? That means trying to provide different kinds of seating depending on your abilities. It means giving really clear wayfinding and like cohesive spaces that just make sense to you. Using warm materials, using materials and colors as ways to create zones so that you understand the space. Really legible space and simple spaces can make a big difference. Also for acoustics, trying to provide places where you can hear people and have a conversation. Or deaf space design, where you're providing enough space for people to be able to have an interpreter or to sign with one another while people can still walk by. Oh, sorry. And then in the units specifically, Rachel spent a lot of time working on the kitchens and trying to create a new kitchen design that could be a command center. So trying to take function and designing for all abilities as like a primary driver of every aspect of that kitchen, where parts and pieces go, how you can fit under the counter, and putting this in as many of the units as possible. So when you're usually required to do 5% accessible units, I think we were able to do about 3 to 4 times that amount of units in the building. The last piece I want to talk about is worth and value. We are trying to understand the business side of affordable housing design and what are the drivers. And the first aspect that we're trying to do is learn from our past mistakes. And so we've undertaken a very serious effort to do post-occupancy evaluations with the scientific method. I also want to give credit to Maggie Harris, who I think is on Zoom right now. Maggie has really led our efforts both through Holst and with her PhD that she's getting at Portland State University right now, to try and help us figure out how to do really good post-occupancy evaluations. And really focusing, if these are all the social determinants of health, focusing on the neighborhood and the built environment as a focus of our research. And then trying to decide between qualitative and quantitative analysis. We've really started with qualitative analysis to understand the anecdotal aspects of living in these buildings versus the quantitative, which we're starting to get more and more into with the actual numbers. And so this, all the work that Maggie is doing is peer reviewed, and has a scientific method behind it, and it's quite rigorous. So a project that we first started with last year is 72 Foster, another REACH project. We were able to go through a year-long analysis with them, looking at age, ethnicity, and gender of residents, looking at the use of mobility equipment, their occupations, time living at the building. We talked not just to residents, but also to the people that work there, whether it's facilities, resident services, property management. And then we looked at really five aspects of living in the building: sound, air quality, temperature, light, and smell, and both comfort in the unit and comfort in the community spaces. And then we collected feedback. We got anecdotal feedback, we got numbers feedback, but really tried to help us understand the implications of the design decisions we kind of make in a vacuum sometimes. And I'll tell you, one of the biggest things we've heard about this project is it's kind of an L-shaped building. We have stairs on the two ends and we have elevators in the middle. And it's very hard to get access to the stairs. And so residents and people working there really wish they had a stair in the middle next to the elevators. And so that's something that we're trying to incorporate into all of our projects now, is a very accessible stair. The last piece I want to talk about is climate. We have a housing crisis, but we also have a carbon and a climate crisis. And so we're trying to understand the implications of our designs as it relates to carbon. We received a grant from the Energy Trust of Oregon. Hannah Rustnick in our office became an Energy Trust Fellow and led this research for us. And we took a look at 8 of our projects to see how they do with both embodied carbon and operational carbon, to understand the whole life carbon of our projects. If you're not aware, I hope you are, 37% of our carbon issue comes from the built environment, comes from buildings. And that's both embodied and operational. And so the projects that we looked at really spanned from missing middle, small scale townhomes and walk-ups all the way to 5/3 podium buildings. And they also included both affordable housing and market rate housing. And ultimately, the main findings we came to, but there are a couple drivers of what reduces the carbon footprint of our buildings. The first is scale. So both the number of units you're doing, if you can build in scale, you're going to be more efficient. But also the smaller, the more compact the living, the less of a carbon footprint you're going to have per bed. But the biggest determinant we found was electrification. And this is really positive for everybody, because these buildings are all about 5 to 8 years old. And so electrification has not been that common, but now electrification is really picking up steam. And the one building that's the purple bar second from the right is the Aurora. And that's our only electrified building in the study. And it's significantly less in both embodied carbon and operational carbon. So we're really excited about all the projects we have coming that are fully electric. So the last thing I wanted to end with is that, housing is about people, housing is about communities, housing's not about money, housing's not about profit. And until we change our mindset in this country about that, we're going to have a hard time making a difference. So let's help change that mindset. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. And last but absolutely not least, Celestina Teva from the DLCD.
Let me make sure I can see the clock here. Let's do this. All right. Oh, almost. I don't want to touch anything. That's Okay. All right. Thanks everybody for making it to the last panel, the last speaker, the last panel. Celestina Teva, she, they, housing planner at DLCD. And I want to start by just saying that I am on the shoulders of giants today. So I'm here to really, give a little bit of an overview of what's going on at the department as it relates to innovation and housing production strategies. But as we had the opportunity to honor today at lunch, the folks on the DLCD housing team, Sean Edging, Mari Valencia Aguilar, and Ethan Stuckmeyer, who have really got a lot of this in motion. I have all of them to thank for the opportunity to be here. So without further ado, innovation in housing production. So, you know, what I've chosen to highlight here today and what I heard that from Sierra and others, we really want to focus in on is going to both talk about innovations in housing production, of course, the housing production strategy program and year one, and also try and connect some of everything that we've heard today so that we can see what we are doing and maybe what's in the future and maybe what we can do even a little bit better. That's a little overview, but I'm just going to move along with it. So, racial equity framework for decision making in the Oregon housing needs analysis rulemaking. So at this point, I think that most people in this room are pretty familiar with the Oregon housing needs analysis at this point, but we are about to embark, and by about to, I mean we have already started, but the heart of the work, our first technical advisory committee meeting that Alan will be with us on, the Needs and Production Advisory Committee starts next week. So we're really digging in here, and the parts of the implementation and rulemaking that I want to highlight today are both that Needs and Production Technical Advisory Committee, because I think some of the conversations that have come up around strategies around accessibility and disability, even around engagement, are deeply connected to the Housing Production Strategy Program. And additionally, we heard a little bit about the equity indicators, these data points that will be generated or some sort of indicator, as well as the housing production dashboard. So those elements are deeply related to the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis implementation. They are not within DLCD's purview. They are with our partner organization, OHCS. But I can drop a note for you all in terms of the question of that process that in the near future, OHCS will be finalizing that those timelines and their engagement opportunities for the equity indicators. And likely some on the methodology as well. So we know that those are going to inform the housing production strategy program, and then we'll be able to build off of those in the process of developing those housing production strategies, and our local partners will be able to look to those as well. So that's as much of an additional note as I can offer there, but that work is indeed, has indeed begun and is around the corner. So, like I mentioned, we have, I didn't mention we have 3 technical advisory committees if you aren't already familiar. The one that, of course, by name most obviously relates to innovation in housing production is the Housing Needs and Production Technical Advisory Committee. And there are really 3 policy areas that technical advisory committee is going to dig into. One of them is the task to write rules that further implement the definition of needed housing and the direction that's in the House Bill 2001 legislation is to define that by characteristics, types, and locations, of course, with the overall goal of increasing production, affordability, and choice. So the second area is the charge to affirmatively further fair housing in the housing production strategy. So I think we heard this either directly or indirectly multiple times today. The current housing production strategy program does already have rules related to affirmatively furthering fair housing, but really bringing that through the housing production strategy program and bringing both a qualitative and quantitative look when we get to think about how those equity indicators play into the program and how the data and the contextualized housing need, as Sam mentioned earlier and others, informs the housing production strategies that local governments actually choose, threading all of that together, and providing that rule and guidance as part of this technical advisory committee in affirmatively furthering fair housing in the housing production strategy program. And then the third point that I'll just highlight, which I think we are really blessed as a department and as a state to have the expertise that we have, not only on this panel, but in this room, and really in all regions, rural, urban, and all specialties across elements of equity, in that I'm really excited for adoption ready policy work. We just heard ideas, and we had work from Holst Architecture. I think it was Rachel, you said, who's really looking at how, different ways that we can measure and different elements that we can incorporate for accessibility and disability in housing, and creating adoption ready policies and programs that we can take off the shelf, that local governments can say, we want to build housing in this way to meet the need that we see we have, is really, really exciting work. So those are the three areas that the technical advisory committee will be digging into. And I want to talk about that work itself, the technical advisory work, the rulemaking advisory committee, the rulemaking process generally, and touch a little bit on the goal 1 conversation from earlier today, and offer a little bit of insight into where we are in trying to implement equity work and community engagement work in this particular rulemaking process. So last year, some of you may know, the Land Conservation and Development Commission adopted a racial equity framework for decision making that all programs at the department use in planning and in execution of those programs. So there are 8 elements. I've highlighted a couple here that speak most directly, perhaps, to goal 1 in community involvement, and that's evaluating historical inequities in community engagement and empowerment. And I also want to highlight, I didn't do this on the slide, but the last element is measuring and evaluating outcomes and continuous improvement. And I wanted to highlight that one because I really don't want it to be overlooked, and I also want to just ensure that we all know that we have an iterative process in this equity work, that what I have to share with you today and what's to come, it will always be reviewed, and we're always looking to do better. So I think I'm really grateful to the Commission for adopting a framework that includes a baked in iterative process. There was one other thing I wanted to mention when we talk about intersectionality and equity, and as you astutely highlighted, Alan, the data that shows us that the folks who are most impacted by disability and lack of accessibility in housing and across our communities are folks of color, is that the racial equity framework that the department adopted leads with race and carries an intersectional approach. So thank you for queuing me up for that, Alan. So that's why it's called a racial equity framework for decision making, and that's kind of the paradigm that we're doing this work in. And the work is growing because we have a really exciting project in the works, which is the Equitable Engagement Toolkit. So this is a project that some other folks on my team are working alongside Knot Studio and Multicultural Collaborative to develop. And it's really trying to condense and elevate equitable engagement best practices in a way that local jurisdictions can take off the shelf and deploy in their communities in order to do equitable engagement work. So like I said, this is I think the kickoff meeting was maybe last month, so it's in its early stages. But for those of you in the room who are excited and energized and inspired by the Goal 1 conversation earlier today, this work might be something that you want to follow. So I just wanted to highlight that. With regard to the rural conversation as well, actually, I wanted to note that the toolkit will be oriented to multiple city population sizes. And, it's not oriented specifically around geography, but it is oriented around city size. And so the hope there is that the engagement toolkit that and recommended tools and best practices for small cities will be able to be deployed in the areas who in some instances we might say need it most. Okay, so with that, I will get into just a couple of quick highlights about the Housing Production Strategy Program. So you all may have seen this graphic a few times. It's also in the packets on your table. And it's a little bit funny to be sharing about the Housing Production Strategy Program in a quick few slides, only because of the knowledge base in the room and the materials in front of you. So if you want more information, there are some great packets available. There's also a whole rulemaking process that contributes to this work. But in 2 slides, we're going to review where it lives here, the housing production strategy, as a part of the Goal 10 work and as kind of the refocus of this major change in Goal 10 housing planning, and a quick review of year 1. So you have heard a little bit today about the housing production strategy reports that have already been received. That was 11 in 2023, and all were approved by the department with conditions. Additionally, in the current biennium, there are 14 housing production strategy planning assistant grants with local governments. So I just wanted to highlight that relationships, and I was just on a call yesterday about a kickoff meeting for a housing production strategy grant. And it's just a reminder of how inspiring our local partners are. Just the planners on the call were already ready to just dig in, particularly with community engagement topics. So I'm excited to see the reports that are developed this year. And in terms of looking backward, one of the big takeaways is just kudos to all of the cities who were in year 1 and are and their consultant teams, because it is not easy to be the first ones in a new program. So definitely wanted to elevate the awesome work and some really amazing strategies and great thinking going on at the local level. And offer that at the housing division, we are doing a little bit more of a thorough look at the year 1 in a more comprehensive look across all of the strategies that we saw, and also about the strategies that we saw that weren't included in the housing production strategy menu that the department currently has. And there are quite a few that are really exciting. And so you can just a little teaser that there will probably at some point be a housing production strategy menu 2.0 that's informed by the local government work and consultant work and really community work that's pushing forward a variety of strategies to further housing production, affordability, and choice. And the last thing I would say on that is that we have collective work ahead to continue to affirmatively further fair housing in the housing production strategy program. As mentioned, that will be a large part of the Needs in Production Technical Advisory Committee. And as we also heard today, there is collective opportunity to contribute to those strategies. Sam's ask for help in some ways and buddies in being a part of creating those housing production strategy programs. And I'll add another note of another conversation that we're having to sort out how to best support you all to plug into that process, because from the DLCD notice side, we are noticing when the reports arrive at our door, at which point they are adopted by the local jurisdiction. And so it's a little bit of an interesting place in terms of comments. And it's not really at the creation point of some of these housing production strategy reports. So just want to know that we've heard that, and that we're sorting out how we can be a support to make it easier for folks in the community to know which local governments are working on their housing production strategy selections and reports, so that it's easier for you all to know when you might want to plug in. So just really trying to increase that accessibility and transparency. I'm just going to touch on two quick things at a high level here, specifically around, what's new and innovations in housing production strategies. So we've heard a couple of folks today mention the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities program. So that is being implemented. Um, oh, I meant to change this slide, but I will verbalize walkable and rollable mixed-use areas. A quick review of the CFA's climate-friendly areas are walkable and rollable mixed-use areas, reducing the need for vehicle trips and trip lengths, commonly located in urban centers and corridors, and that cities over 10,000 in population will adopt CFAs with sufficient zoned capacity for at least 30% of housing needs. So really trying to allow for many homes in the climate-friendly areas to decrease our carbon impacts. Thank you, Dave, also for doing the work on your end in the built environment to contribute to this climate work. So just a quick review that the CFEC rules apply in the 8 metropolitan areas in the state. And so far where we are is that nearly all of the climate-friendly area studies have been received by the department. By the end of this month, they will all have comments from DLCD. And by the end of this year, all of the jurisdictions are expected to adopt their climate-friendly area studies. Lastly, I wanted to mention the mass timber code up project. So we heard a little bit about modular housing today. We know that the timelines in which we can be responsive to housing need are both related to land acquisition and getting the projects queued up, but also how quickly we can actually get the homes built. And we have a number of barriers to that, but there is also a lot of innovation in construction type. So the Mass Timber Code Up project is something that DLCD has gotten involved with as part of the Mass Timber Coalition. The Mass Timber Coalition is funded by the Build Back Better funding through the United States Economic Development Administration. It has a number of partners, DLCD being one of them. And if you're not as familiar with the project's vision, it's a vision for a thriving mass timber industry cluster in Oregon. And so this includes, economic development. And, I'm reminded I'm reminded of some of Connie's comments about, both having a workforce and also needing housing. And so not only is this an economic development initiative, but it's also a housing initiative. This isn't something that our department is working on as closely because it is housed as an economic development initiative, but some of my colleagues really wanted me to make sure that the fact that it is also a housing initiative is not lost. For the most part, and most of the projects related to mass timber right now are housing oriented. And one of the deliverables of the grant from the DLCD side is a model code and audit workbook, which is completed. So you all can expect to see this available sometime, probably in the next few weeks. And it's a workbook, code audit workbook that's targeted for small cities or cities with less capacity to both do an audit of their code to make sure that they are reducing barriers to the placement of mass timber units. And it's specifically single unit detached homes, which really, as we prepare for the likely emergence of a number of different housing construction types, this is just one that is recently innovative. The audit workbook will apply you know, it's not specific to construction type, it's more specific to housing type. So how can we make sure that there are no prohibitions on construction type in our zoning codes, as well as that the zoning codes can functionally support the placement of whether it's mass timber homes, whether they're not mass timber, but they are prefabricated homes, even manufactured homes, really across the board. So that, keep your eyes open for that workbook to be released. And then the other deliverable that's in the DLCD portion of the coalition is technical code assistance grants. So a couple of those are underway and a couple are about to kick off. And I believe that those first 4 cities are all wildfire recovery technical assistance grants. So really trying to match this potentially, you know, rapid construction type with recovery housing or post-disaster not recovery housing in the sense of substance use, although that is potentially another application, but specifically trying to recover post-wildfire. But that is not, the technical assistance grants are not limited to that, but I just thought I would add that note as well. And with that, I've got a couple of contacts, namely because we tried to carry a lot here for you today based on what it sounded like you all were interested in, but the housing team isn't leading all of this work. So a couple of contacts if you want to ask some more questions about CFEC or about the Mass Timber Project. And with that, thank you so much. I'll hand it over to Sierra.
Thank you so much to Alan, Dave, and Celestina. Those were outstanding presentations. We have time for 2 questions. Who is my Oprah? Do I have an Oprah in the room? Oh, Sam. I'd love to get one in the room, one virtual person.
First, I just want to mention to, sorry, I have to look for your his names, but Alan, just that your presentation specifically spoke to me because when I started doing this work, I didn't intend on focusing on homelessness. I intended on focusing on seniors and people in the aging demographic because Curry County is the 2nd highest senior demographic in Oregon. And so a lot of my projects focus around mobility issues. We have a lot of people with disabilities as well, and that is clearly represented and overrepresented in the homeless population that I work with. So that's why we shifted to homelessness as opposed to helping seniors access healthcare, because the seniors were on the street. So, and then the other thing I wanted to mention to you, sorry, again, names, is it Celeste? Is that okay?
Celestina.
Celestina. Is the only thing I noticed is that oftentimes when these come out, these sort of regulations around housing and land use and all of that, it's typically concentrated, or it's a suggestion for communities under 10,000. And I think that if we really wanted to move the needle, we would make it a requirement. And I understand that there's some limitations on capacity and all of that, but I think the only way to spur those communities like mine, which is 7,000, to build in that capacity is to require it. And again, that's the hard hand from Salem, but we need that, the small groups of us on the ground trying to do the work. And so it's not so much a question, but I don't know if you can speak to any of the reason why they typically do only are enforced for 10,000 and more population.
I could speak specifically to Oregon Housing Needs Analysis and just encourage you all to speak to your legislators. And I heard you earlier express that you are experiencing challenge with that, but that is specified in the statute. So in the bills that are passed. So at the agency level where we are, rulemaking and implementing that, to what cities the rules apply has already been determined.
But I will say Tillamook is going to be a very interesting test case. All of Tillamook County is going to be subject to the large city standards for, yeah.
For sure, Sam. Yeah, that's a great mention. The state legislators in Tillamook County came together and pushed for Tillamook, any jurisdiction in Tillamook County to basically be considered a large city or be subject to the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Goal 10 planning requirements. So we will see where that goes and how we can best support and be collaborative to the jurisdictions that are smaller in size and see what that rollout looks like. But it is exciting, and I think the point there is there's nothing that precludes folks from wanting to participate. Absolutely. So if you're excited and engaged, and that's something that you want to see in your community, I think it's definitely available.
Do we want to do one more, Sam? There is one question from Rachel online, but it's kind of long and complicated, so I think it might be better for us to follow up afterwards about that. So one more from our in-person audience before we close out.
Run across the room. I heard a lot today about protecting housing from market pressures and making housing a human right instead of a commodity on the market. And I heard about planning for the next generation, but I didn't hear about community land trusts, which to me are like the perfect melding of, insulating housing and land from market pressures forever, for generations into the future. So I just wondered if anyone had, if there was energy around that. That's my thought.
I'll just quickly note that it's a hugely important thing here in Portland, that there's some great work that's happening that's kind of melding community land trust with kind of permaculture and thinking about aging in place. But I think that there's also some great examples we heard at the Oregon APA conference this last year about some innovations that's happening around affordable housing, socially connected housing, and land trusts are really an opportunity for folks to get a piece of the pie. Unfortunately, that's the commodification of this, but I truly believe that that's an opportunity for folks, and we need to be exploring it across the state.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for the question. And there were a number of comments today that I wish we'd have time to unpack, but I heard a comment earlier about, are we planning for ownership versus rental when we're zoning, and what does that look like? And we know that that's something that cities have been planning for, and we did see in the housing production strategies, and it's something that we're continuing to evolve about. How do we plan for both, and how do we serve both, and also maybe to not make it both. Maybe how are we expanding our concept of tenure from ownership and rental to include community land trust, to think about cooperative housing, resident-owned cooperatives, shared equity, limited equity, combining CLTs and co-ops. And so I think that's something that the Technical Advisory Committee for Needs in Production will have the opportunity to dig into a little bit, and continuing to look at ways where we're not just binarily looking at ownership and rental, but what are the long-term ways we can create permanent, stable, affordable housing? I would say definitely is part of the conversation.
And we're going to have to wrap it up there, and I'm going to turn it over to Board President Jennifer. Thank you all so much for being here. Super appreciate it.